Hello, welcome to our tissues chapter, and although this is not as fun or effective as studying this information in person and in a laboratory, we will make the most of what we can do remotely. In this video recording, I will combine the lecture information with a lot of the lab information so that you can be studying it in one go. Once you have access to the laboratory, we will look at many of these microscope slides and explore the tissues in person. The first tissue type that we'll talk about is epithelial tissue. There are several different types of epithelial tissue, and we'll go through all of them as theoretical functional units, but also what they look like in lab. And we will look at some examples of each. Epithelial tissue lines spaces. It's also characterized by the fact that it's made of continuous sheet or sheets of cells. So the cells are really, really tightly touching each other. Also, these tissues are highly regenerative, meaning they undergo mitosis pretty continually. They're avascular, and what that means is that there are no blood vessels that are actually going through the middle of this tissue. They are highly innervated, meaning that there are a lot of nerve endings for sensation that are found in between the cells of this tissue. And the cells have directionality. And I'll talk a little bit more about the directionality, but it means basically that there is a top surface called the apical surface. So think apex predator is the predator at the top of the food chain. So think of top, right? Apical surface. And this is the surface that is facing whatever space that tissue is lining. So we have epithelial tissue on the, our skin is made of partly of epithelial tissue, the stuff that's on the outside. And the very, very top of the skin layer is the apical surface of that tissue. But if the cell layer is lining, let's say, our stomach, then the apical surface is the side of the cell layer that is facing the interior of your stomach, into like the hollow space of the stomach. The other side of epithelial tissue is called basal surface. So it's the opposite side. And there it's always going to be attached to a structure called a basement membrane, and it's going to be connective tissue of some kind that is kind of holding everything down. So let's look at some functions of epithelial tissues. As I already mentioned, they line spaces, and it can be the actual outside of your body, but also the spaces or lumen inside of your body. It's used for protection from being rubbed or hurt. Think of your skin again. The epithelial tissue also works in secretion of mucus, sweat, hormones, and other things, and absorption, which is especially true in your digestive tract. It's also important in filtration and in sensation. All of those will come up as we're studying more different organs and organ systems. So one more time here let's say that this is someone, looking at a cube of tissue, and this layer at the top, and you can see it's a single layer of cells, but they are packed very, very, very tightly. And just that single layer of tightly packed cells would be the epithelial tissue. And it is sitting on some other kind of tissue, and it's connective tissue. The layer of stuff, there's going to be like sticky proteins and all kinds of things that is kind of gluing the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue is called the basal membrane. So the side of the cells that are touching the basal membrane are called That's the basal surface of those cells, whereas the side of the cells that are not touching anything because they are out in the space, right? Maybe this is inside of your stomach or something. That is called the apical or free surface of the epithelium. Okay, so these are some general characteristics that are true for all epithelial tissues. However, there are many different types, and let's look at how the different types are classified. There's a pretty good pattern here, so let's look. First, we look at the shape of the cells that make up the epithelial tissue. And there are three general shapes. I mean, some of them are kind of like, you know, they vary within a range. But there are very, very flat cells. They look like a fried egg, and the yolk being the nucleus. The nucleus is the least flat part, but everything else is almost like there's nothing there. It's so flat. That shape of cells is called a squamous epithelial cell. Cells that are about as big as they are, tall as they are wide, and have a circular-ish nucleus that's about in the middle. Those are cuboidal epithelial cells. And cells that are taller than they are wide and have a nucleus that's more oval, those are called columnar epithelial cells. Okay. So squamous, cuboidal, columnar. Those are three types of cell shapes for epithelial tissue. Then the next thing that we classify epithelial tissue by is how many layers of cells there are. If there is only one layer of tightly packed cells, which is the example you saw in 2 slides ago when I was showing you the apical membrane, or the apical side, which would be up here, and the basal side that's connected to the basement membrane in blue here. This is just a one layer of tightly packed cells, and so we say it's simple epithelium. So when someone says it's simple epithelium, what you know from that phrase is that it is a single layer of tightly packed cells that on one side is attached to a basement membrane of some connective tissue, and on the other side of those cells, it's some sort of a hollow space. If there are more than one layer of epithelial cells, then it's called stratified epithelium. So what stratified epithelium, that phrase means, is there are at least 2 layers on top of each other of tightly packed epithelial cells. And the bottom side, the basal side of the lowest layer is attached to a basement membrane, and the apical side of the top layer is free and is lining some sort of a space. There is one kind of a wonky arrangement that's called pseudo-stratified epithelium. And you know that pseudo means, looks like something but isn't that. Pseudo-stratified epithelium is when you have a single layer of cells, meaning it's really simple epithelium, but because the cells are not all the same shape and size, when you look at that tissue, if you were to look at it under the microscope, it kind of looks like it's many layers. See how the nuclei are in different places and the cells are kind of different weird shapes. So it looks like it's multi-layers, but it's not. Okay? And when you have some time to look at the samples of real microscopy images and actually look at slides in the lab, you will see the difference between all 3 of these. So in pseudo-stratified epithelium, you only have one layer of cells, but some of them are spanning from the basement membrane all the way to the apical side, whereas other cells are much shorter, so they're only attached at the basal membrane but do not reach the apical side, right? So they're all attached at the basal membrane, but only some of them reach the apical side where the space is, and the nuclei are all in different places. That is pseudostratified epithelium. All right, so if we want to name epithelial tissue, we combine how many layers there are to that tissue with the cell shape of the topmost layer. Okay, so simple squamous epithelium, we already know what that is. It means one layer of cells only, and all of the cells are squamous, meaning really, really flat. That tissue type is excellent for diffusion because it is a very, very short distance that things have to go. So if you have something lining a space and that liner is made out of simple squamous epithelium, then it's really easy for things to go from the space to the tissue that is under the epithelium, right? The epithelium is just the liner, and stuff has to get through the liner. So if you make that liner really, really, really thin, it's easy to do that. Now, I'll show you an example of that. If we have stratified squamous, what that means is you have many, many layers of cells. Well, at least two, but it could be many layers of cells. And the cells at the apical end of the tissue are squamous. Generally, the cells that are at the basal membrane are going to be a different shape. So we're only caring about the top layer of cells. Simple cuboidal means it's just a single layer of cuboidal cells. Simple columnar, just a single layer of columnar cells. They often have microvilli or some other projections to increase their surface area, or for some sort of motility reasons. Pseudostratified is also just a single layer, but it's wonky. And then there's one other type called transitional, and that means that it has several layers of cells, but, and let that hang there, we'll come to transitional. It's for stretching. So simple squamous epithelium, single layer of flat, broad cells. If you were to look eagle's eye view at that type of tissue, it would look like this, right? Cells packed really, really, really tight. Right now, we're just looking at the apical surface of these cells, and there's like no space in between them. These cells are connected to each other by tight junctions, and they form a really, really good barrier. You will find simple squamous epithelial tissue lining blood vessels and lymph vessels. That specific type of simple squamous epithelium that lines blood vessels and lymph vessels is called endothelium. You will also find simple squamous epithelial tissue in the serous membranes, and we learned about parietal, visceral serous membrane, the pericardium, peritoneum, etc. And you also find this tissue type, simple squamous epithelium, making up the alveoli, the tiny sacs that take in oxygen and let go of carbon dioxide in your lungs. So the main function of this tissue type is filtration and diffusion. Right now, I would encourage you to pause the video and explain out loud in your own words why specifically having one layer of very, very flat, very tightly packed cells is good for filtration and diffusion. Okay. Simple cuboidal epithelium is generally found in, it's a single layer of cube-shaped cells, and it's generally found in tubes and glands and ducts for secretion and absorption. So you can see how, okay, they're definitely not totally cube shaped, but they're cube-ish, right here. And the nucleus, this is the dark purple nucleus, the cell is right here. This is the basement membrane of the cell, and this is the lumen. So think of this as like a macaroni noodle, and we have sliced it and we're looking head on at the macaroni noodle. So the actual macaroni material is this, and it's made up of simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay? And this is the opening inside of the duct, or the noodle. So this is the apical side of these epithelial cells, and this is the basal side attached to the basement membrane. Okay. Simple columnar epithelium is just a single layer of tall column-shaped cells. They will often have microvilli in order to increase the surface area of the cells. So notice here in this image how there is the basement membrane that they're all attached to, and then this is the apical surface. And the reason why it has like a line and then something above the line is because that is the brush border, or like that area that has those microvilli. Because they're so close to one another, it kind of looks like this separate layer. The nuclei are oval, and they're all in around the same area over here. These cells function really well in absorption and secretion, and they're found in the stomach, intestine, gallbladder, uterine tubes, kidneys, etc. Okay, in lots of different areas. Right here is a different type of cell that we haven't talked about called the goblet cell that is specialized for secretion. So it's a modified epithelial cell. That's why it looks different and has a bunch of mucus product in there that is going to secrete to the apical surface of these cells. Okay. So here's a comparison between simple cuboidal and simple columnar epithelium. This particular image was selected because it was extremely obvious. In real samples, it's less obvious, and sometimes it's kind of hard to tell, but you want to look at the general width to height ratio and how oval or circular the nuclei are. So again, this is right here a single cell, a single columnar epithelial cell, and this dark oval is the nucleus of that cell. This is the space, right? All epithelial tissue is lining some sort of space. So there's an empty space here. This is an empty space, probably some duct over here. So this is the apical side of the epithelial tissue, and this is the basal side of epithelial tissue. Now, pseudostratified epithelium is often ciliated, meaning it has cilia at the top, right? If you remember from your previous classes, cilia are small projections, and they generally move. They do not always move, but they generally move, and so they can sweep, make a current or sweep mucus across the apical surface of the cell. Okay. So they are a one layer of cells, and every single cell is attached at the basement membrane. But not every cell makes it to the surface, so they do not all have this apical surface. Some of them just kind of get crowded in the middle. And notice that the nuclei are definitely all over the place. It's very staggered looking in comparison to the sample that we had in the previous slide to the simple columnar epithelium. Okay. These types of tissues generally function to have their cilia sweep away mucus. So these cells will create, especially if you have this goblet cell, will create mucus secreted to the apical surface, and then the cilia are able to sweep that mucus around and kind of get out debris, trapped particles. This is found in respiratory tract, right? So in your nasal cavity, trachea, and bronchi, where it's really important that we don't let foreign material in. Now let's look at stratified epithelium. Remember, in general, stratified epithelium just means several layers, more than two, or two or more, I should say, two or more layers of epithelial cells. So cells that are very tightly packed together by those tight junctions. The type of tissue that we're going to talk a lot about in the future next chapter actually, is stratified squamous epithelium. That means that there are many layers of the cells. However, the top layer has the squamous shape. Okay? So the basal layers are going to be more cuboidal-ish, but we don't care about that in the naming practice. The naming first, are there more than one layer? If there are two or more layers, then it's stratified. And what is the shape of the most superior layer? The layer closest to the open space, right? Because we're lining open spaces with this kind of tissue. There are two types of stratified squamous epithelial tissue: keratinized and non-keratinized. What it means is keratinized, several of the top layers of cells, which are generally all going to be squamous in shape, they're going to be dead cells. We'll talk more about that in the future chapter, and they shed off. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium does not have that layer of dead squamous cells. So keratinized is found pretty much only on your skin, so facing the outside environment, and this is really important so we don't dry out that dead layer of cells on top of our stratified squamous epithelium is there to keep moisture in and become a really, really strong barrier to things coming in and also to things leaving. Whereas non-keratinized is still many layers. It still is protective because we have many layers, but the cells do not have to be dead because they're not facing an outside dry environment. So these are found in your oral cavity, so in your mouth, in the pharynx, which is the back of your mouth, kind of your throat, the esophagus, right, the tube that's going down to your digestive tract, anus, and inside of your vagina, for those of you who have a vagina. So the general function of stratified squamous epithelium, keratinized or non-keratinized, is to protect against abrasion. So this is epithelial tissue that lines spaces, as they all do, but it lines spaces where there's going to be a lot of stress. You're constantly getting nicked and scratched and rubbed in those places. We want to protect from that, so we have many, many layers of cells. It also protects against water loss, especially if it's keratinized, ultraviolet radiation, and foreign invasion. Okay, more on this in the next chapter. All right. We will talk about keratin, which is a type of protein that is abundant in keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, more in the next chapter. Here I'll just tell you that it's in those top layers of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and it makes the top layer really tough and water resistant. Finally, for the last type of epithelium, transitional epithelium. I told you that it was kind of a weird type. And it is only found really in your bladder and ureters, and then the top part of the urethra. Okay? So what is the function of those places? Well, the bladder is storing a lot of fluid, right? Your urine. And the ureters bring what's going to be urine from the kidneys to the bladder. And then we have another tube called urethra that takes from urine from the bladder to the outside of the body, right, to pee it out. And these places need to be able to stretch. So if there's a lot of fluid in there, they need to be able to expand and make space for that fluid. If there isn't, then they can relax, take up less space. So this is a stratified type of epithelium, but it has a visible appearance in that the top layer of the the apical layer of the epithelial cells, it has this like balloony appearance. They look like balloons. And they don't have a very obvious shape. They're kind of circular or balloon shaped all throughout, especially on the apical surface. So when if you see a tissue that has this kind of structure where it looks like it's many layers, but it's not squamous, and the top kind of has this balloony shape, then it will be transitional epithelium, and it is only found in bladder, ureters, and the top part of the urethra. So it maintains protective lining and allows it to stretch. So once it's stretched, it almost looks like simple epithelium, like there's only one layer. But when it's relaxed, it looks like there are many more layers. So it's transitions from one to the other. We are not going to look at examples of stratified columnar epithelium, which is quite rare in the body in this chapter. So one of the toughest jobs is to recognize from different perspectives what these tissues look like. So this is, right, simple squamous. How are they both simple squamous? What the heck? Well, on the right-hand side, you have a head-on view. You're looking just from the top. So they look like, the ground in the desert. These are the squamous cells, kind of weird shape with the nucleus inside, and they're very, very tightly packed. Whereas on the left, you're looking at a cross-section of the tissue. You see there's a big space. If you see a big space, that means that space will have to be lined by epithelial tissue. And when you're like, wait, is there anything even in there or not? It's so flat. That's probably because it's simple squamous epithelium. For lecture, you will not need to be identifying pictures. However, it's going to be particularly important that you kind of understand how structure relates to function, right? So I stole this from a different textbook, and I like how it identifies these tissues based on their function of exchange, transport, whether it has cilia, right, to move things, whether it has a protective function or a secretory function to secrete things. So I would like you, although I already talked about it, to take some time to figure out how the relationship between the cell shape and the layer of cells is connected to the function. And there are some examples of these different, exchange epithelium, transport, ciliated, protective, and secretory epithelium in different parts of your body. All right, there are a couple of things that are related to epithelial tissue, but I will take a pause and hope you do as well.